On June 5, 1947, George C. Marshall stood at Harvard University and delivered a speech that sounded almost plain. It did not begin with thunder. It did not promise a dramatic military victory. Marshall spoke in the restrained language of a soldier turned Secretary of State. Europe was in trouble. Its economies were broken. Its harvests and factories were not yet restored, and the United States had to help create conditions in which recovery could actually take hold. The address lasted only minutes, but it became the public starting point for one of the most consequential recovery programs of the 20th century. To understand why the speech mattered, picture Europe 2 years after the Second World War ended. Cities had been bombed, ports damaged, bridges destroyed, and rail networks strained. Millions of people were displaced. Food supplies were uncertain. Coal shortages could close factories and leave homes cold. Governments were trying to rebuild budgets, currencies, and basic legitimacy at the same time. Victory had ended the fighting in Western Europe, but peace had not automatically restored trade, production, or confidence. The question was not only whether Europe needed money. It was whether Europe could recover quickly enough to avoid another spiral of scarcity, political extremism, and strategic vulnerability. Marshall's speech was careful because the policy problem was delicate. The United States did not want to appear as though it was simply dictating a plan to European governments. Marshall argued that the initiative should come from Europe itself. European states, he said in effect, needed to agree on their requirements and their joint program, while the United States would support a serious recovery effort. That detail matters. The Marshall Plan was not just a pile of checks. It pushed European cooperation, planning, and prioritization at a time when national economies were exhausted and suspicion remained strong. The man giving the speech carried unusual authority. George Marshall had served as U.S. Army Chief of Staff during the war and had helped manage the immense mobilization that defeated Axis powers. By 1947, as Secretary of State under President Harry Truman, he was not selling a partisan stunt. He was describing a strategic necessity. American leaders had watched post-war relief programs struggle against the scale of Europe's crisis. They had also watched the Soviet Union expand influence in Eastern Europe, and communist parties gain strength in parts of Western Europe. Recovery and security were becoming inseparable. The Harvard Address did not create the full program by itself. That is one of the myths worth correcting. After the speech, European governments met, assessed needs, and developed a coordinated proposal. The Soviet Union rejected participation and pressured states under its influence not to join. That rejection deepened the emerging division of Europe. In Washington, the Truman administration had to persuade Congress that a massive recovery program was worth the cost. The final European recovery program was authorized in 1948, not on the Harvard stage in 1947. But the speech provided the public frame. Economic recovery was not charity alone. It was the foundation of political stability and peace. The plan that followed moved food, fuel, raw materials, machinery, and financial support into participating European economies. It backed imports that helped restart production and relieved shortages that had made daily life precarious. It encouraged cooperation through the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, the body that later formed part of the institutional path toward the OECD. The program also sent a message. The United States would remain deeply engaged in European recovery instead of retreating after the war as it had after the First World War. For ordinary Europeans, recovery was not experienced as a single grand abstraction. It could mean coal arriving before winter, a factory able to buy machine tools, a port moving cargo again, a farmer getting equipment, or a government stabilizing its currency enough for wages and prices to make sense. The Marshall Plan did not solve every problem, and European recovery also depended on local labor, policy choices, existing industrial capacity, and political compromises inside each country. But the program helped remove bottlenecks at a moment when bottlenecks could become crises. The plan also reshaped the Cold War. Soviet leaders saw the program as an American attempt to pull Europe into a U.S.-led economic bloc. In Eastern Europe, governments aligned with Moscow stayed out. In Western Europe, participation helped anchor countries more firmly in an American-backed order that soon included NATO. The Marshall Plan was therefore both recovery policy and geopolitical architecture. It was humanitarian in its concern for hunger and ruin, economic in its emphasis on production and trade, and strategic in its effort to prevent instability from becoming a weapon for rival power. The numbers were large, but the deeper importance was structural. Between 1948 and 1952, the United States provided billions of dollars in assistance under the European Recovery Program. In today's money, historians and economists debate exact comparisons because inflation, production, and purchasing power are measured in different ways. What is clearer is the political choice. The United States committed a significant share of national resources to help rebuild former allies, former enemies, and the wider market system on which post-war stability depended. The legacy is sometimes simplified into a slogan, "Just do another Marshall Plan." That phrase appears after wars, natural disasters, financial crises, and Reconstruction debates. But Marshall's original lesson is more demanding than the slogan. The program worked because it connected money to institutions, logistics, planning, political legitimacy, and security. It asked recipients to coordinate. It asked the donor government to sustain public support. It treated economic breakdown as a danger that could spread across borders. And it recognized that rebuilding is not only about replacing what was destroyed. It is about restoring the confidence that people, businesses, and governments can plan for the future. There were limits and exclusions. The program did not erase colonial tensions, class conflict, or all post-war hardship. It did not include Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe, and that absence reflected and reinforced the continent's division. It was shaped by American interests as well as generosity. A serious documentary has to hold those facts together. The Marshall Plan was not pure altruism, and it was not cynical empire-building alone. It was a policy born from fear, memory, strategic calculation, and a real understanding that mass deprivation could wreck democracy. That is why the quiet Harvard speech still matters. Marshall did not announce an invasion or a treaty. He described a problem that crossed borders and argued that recovery had to be organized before desperation hardened into politics. On June 5, 1947, the United States publicly chose a post-war role that linked prosperity, alliance, and security. The speech did not rebuild Europe by itself, but it opened the door to a program that helped turn ruins, shortages, and suspicion into a new Atlantic order. In a world that still argues about reconstruction, aid, alliances, and the price of stability, Marshall's plain words remain a reminder that the aftermath of war can be as decisive as the war itself.